coming up on Chopper's Politics.
Come on, Caroline. It's like a schoolgirl, isn't it? Like maybe a little posh girl at school.
I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. Well, it's nearly over. Freedom of a sort is in sight. For some, too early. For others, too late. And the price of freedom? Well, we're now left with a litany of complicated rules that make imposing the lockdown look comparatively easy. To weigh up whether the government is reading the mood of the nation right, I'll be joined by Professor Matthew Goodwin from Kent University, who'll be telling us whether pollsters or MPs know best. Plus, you might have been enjoying her lockdown lip-syncing. Comedian Maggie Foster will be telling me about how she chooses her political targets and her plans for the future. But first up, the government has faced increased criticism over how it's handled schooling during the COVID-19 crisis, with questions asked about the failure to fully open schools ahead of shops and cinemas. With a generation of children missing out on many months of education, what's the impact for years to come? Here to discuss this right now with me is Robert Halfon, Tory MP for Harlow and Chairman of the Education Select Committee in the House of Commons. Robert Halfon, welcome to the podcast. I hope the weather's good for you in Harlow.
It's beautiful. In the little room I work in, it's baking hot this time because the sun comes in the morning on this side of the house, but it'll be okay in the afternoon.
Of course, and you've been doing your job from home, haven't you? You've been isolating slightly, haven't you, because of COVID?
Since the 19th of March in the afternoon, I had my last community meeting at lunchtime, so I remember it well. So it's about 13 weeks today, I think.
So you haven't seen anybody in person, have you, from outside your family since then?
In fact, I've not seen my family. Luckily, I've got my wonderful wife. She's been at work because she's a critical worker, but I've literally been at home, apart from the car once or twice, just to check the battery.
I wonder if it's made you relate more to the pupils who have been frozen out of school since the point you went into lockdown. They've also been unable to see their friends properly and do any work. And there's a feeling of listlessness. They've lost an entire term of schooling. I mean, it's a national scandal, isn't it?
I think it's a national disaster. We now know from serious academic studies that over 2 million children have not been learning hardly anything at all at home, and over 4 million children have had hardly any contact with their teachers. So we potentially face an epidemic of education poverty, a safeguarding crisis. A lot of these kids have been exposed to online harms on the internet. Joining county gangs, may face really tough situations at home, high-pressured environments. Their parents might have been made redundant or even worse things going on. And of course, we now know there's a huge digital divide in our country. And as the Children's Commissioner points out, that 700,000 children still don't have access to a proper tablet or computer or desktop at home. So this is a national disaster. We're potentially destroying the life chances of these children, stopping them climb the education ladder of opportunity. And we really need a serious programme to help these children, and we need to get our children back to school as soon as possible.
What do you think when you hear Boris Johnson announce this week that all schools, that state schools, will be back in September?
Well, I'm very glad that he's made that announcement, but believe me, I'm no Puritan. I love pubs and I can't wait to go and sit in a pub and have a Guinness when I'm unshielded, so to speak. And I'm not a killjoy, but you see pictures of thousands of people on a beach. You know that kids and parents can go to Primark whenever they want. The restaurants and pubs are going to open, and yet our schools are still not open until September. And we have to ask ourselves, what is our priority? Surely our priority as a country must be not just for the economy, but also for education as well, to get our children learning, to make sure that we don't damage their development in life, because all the studies show, even just over the summer holidays, normal summer holidays without the coronavirus, it takes quite a while for children to get back into the groove of learning again. And by September, they will have lost up to 40% of the school year. And there should have been a national plan from the beginning. The governments, understandably in some ways, have focused on what I call in stopping destitution and stopping death. And what I mean by that is they focused on the economy and health. But education should have been part of that triangle from day one. And they've done some good things, the Oak Academy, the voucher scheme, the online learning classes, the £1 billion that's just been announced for catch up. All that is really welcome. But there should have been a national plan from day one, just as there was a national plan for health.
Why do you think there hasn't been? Forgive me for cutting in there. Do you think that there are too many people in the cabinet who went to private school, who have their kids at private school? Or I'll go wider than that, not the cabinet, but the decision makers, that they can't quite feel or see what's going on at the state level?
Well, I've learnt, and one of the reasons why I'm a Conservative is because I don't look at where people have come from. I look at what people do. I think the reason for it is because a number of things. There's been a huge focus on avoiding destitution and trying to avoid deaths. So economy, health.
Yeah.
The second thing is there has been opposition from not all unions, but the biggest ones have opposed school openings. Even the modest opening at the beginning of June, early years, year one in primary schools, was vehemently opposed by some of the trade unions. So that has made it harder. But there should have been a vision from the Prime Minister at the very beginning. I like him a lot. I regard myself as a loyal Boris supporter. But he needs to place as much importance on education as he does on infrastructure and levelling up. And we should have had a national army of educational volunteers. Why on earth aren't Ofsted inspectors, who many are not deployed at the moment, why on earth are they not properly working with local councils and schools to identify the left behind children who are not learning and help them learn? Why don't we have armies of graduates? Why don't we have retired teachers helping the schools get the vulnerable kids back to school? We know 85% of vulnerable children have not been in school, and this is what is a disaster, and we've got to make a difference.
What do you think parents can do? There's no kind of national parents group, is there? In a way, there's like a patients association, there's other kind of groups that represent what parents want. Do you think there needs to be a big parents body to try and put pressure on teachers and schools to get back?
Well, there are great organisations like Mumsnet and so on. I mean, first of all, what I should do is also pay tribute to the teachers and support staff, because people often forget the support staff who have kept the schools open for children of critical workers and some vulnerable children over these past months. And some of them, very small amount, have been going to school, but they have been heroic, and it's important that we recognise that. But what I think we need to do is actually learn from best practice. So if you take an example of St Paul's School in Kent, they've set up marquees in the playground. Other schools in London, I think the Oasis Academy has worked with a nearby hotel, so they have extra classroom space. So one of my favourite people is Nicholas Winton, and he was the man who did the kinder transport, brought the Jewish children to England. There's a wonderful sculpture in Liverpool Street Station about him. And he said, if it's not impossible, there must be a way to do it. I have that quote on my business cards. And what we should be is there's 5 million reasons why the computer says no, as schools can't open, that we can't have summer schools, that we can't have a national volunteer scheme, that we can't help the left behind pupils. But actually, if it's not impossible, there must be a way to do it. And we should have had that can-do attitude. And we need to learn from those model schools.
It's almost that 2012 Olympic spirit, isn't it? To channel that kind of national endeavour behind this idea of getting these kids back in some form of education.
Well, we had 700,000 people join the health volunteer scheme, which was brilliant, and they were delivering food to people's homes. Why wasn't a parallel scheme set up for education from day one? That should have happened. And what we need to do, we've got now the 1 billion catch-up from the government, which will help schools have catch-up programmes. And as Gavin Williamson confirmed to me in the House of Commons a couple of days ago, that they can have summer schools or summer camps if they want. It won't happen everywhere, but just because it doesn't happen everywhere doesn't mean they shouldn't happen anywhere.
Yes, quite. Do you blame the so-called blob, this idea which is first used, I think, by Dominic Cummings when he is with Michael Gove in the education department, of this resistant group of teachers, officials, whoever it might be, who don't want to get back to work?
Well, I'm not a confrontational politician, and I genuinely don't like using words like that. But what I will say, I absolutely don't understand that the people who have opposed schools opening at every step of the way, whoever they may be, they say they're worried about the risks of the coronavirus, which we know are minimal. The World Health Organization, 22 EU countries, the chief medical officer, the science study after science study. But whilst they place the risk, they go on about that, what about the risk to all these children at home not learning, the worries for their mental health, their safeguarding? Why has not as much risk been placed on children at home not learning in very tough environments, on what is happening to disadvantaged kids, as much as the very minimal risk to the coronavirus in schools.
The Telegraph is reporting on Thursday morning about social distancing not applying in schools. So perhaps we're getting our act together. I mean, it's only late June, Rob. We're not in September yet.
Well, I think it's great news that is happening. Any measures to get our kids back into the school should be welcomed, and we'll wait to see what the guidance is from the government. But we've got a long time between now and September. Hopefully the disease will have even climbed even further down the coronavirus mountain by then. But what about learning now? What about a programme of summer schools across the country? What about using the amazing education charities like Tutor Trust, Action Tutoring, Teach First to get kids learning over the next few weeks? That's what I would be doing, because we need to help make sure that they can catch up before they go back in September.
Are you embarrassed to be a Conservative MP over this school's fiasco?
I'm very proud to be a Conservative MP, and I do accept that the government have had 1,000,001 things to do, and they've had to intervene in almost every aspect of our lives, everything from the opening of pubs to furlough schemes, whatever it may be. But I want the government to be a social justice Conservative government. I want it to be a government that has a passion for education and skills, to help these kids, but also to make sure that, we don't have thousands of apprentices being laid off or made redundant. We've got to build an apprenticeship and skills nation. And I just want the government to place as much attention. This has got to come from the top.
Yeah. So there's a risk, surely, that the country may not forgive the Conservative Party if we see massive inequality rising. I know we're 4.5 years out from an election, but that's a worry, isn't it? It must be an electoral risk here for the Tory party as well.
It is a huge risk because the people voted for Prime Minister in the election, not just because of Brexit, which absolutely was a number one issue, but also because they felt that he was on the side of working people. So if we're on the side of working people, we have to be the social justice party. It has to be first and foremost. Prime Minister should be making speeches about addressing social injustice, not in a woolly way, but serious proposals, everything from education to affordable housing. I mean, we have this awful problem with permitted development rights in my constituency of Harlow, with often single parents living in tiny box rooms that are really small rooms. Can you imagine a parent with a child having been a lockdown over the past few weeks, stuck in a big tower block in a tiny little room? And what are we doing for those people? What are we saying that we are going to do to help people on low incomes climb up that ladder of opportunity? What safety net are we going to provide them? We must be the party of the poor, of the disadvantaged, of the lower paid, of social justice. Otherwise, we might as well pack up our bags and go home. And that has to be the mission of the Prime Minister as we come out of this coronavirus.
Yes, quite. Robert Halfon, what's your advice to parents listening into this? What should they be doing? Should they be contacting their school, asking when they're opening, put pressure on head teachers, councils, their MPs, the Prime Minister? What should they be doing?
Well, of course, I understand parents will have worries. It's human to have worries, and we need to make sure that everything is safe, absolutely. But it is better for your child to be in school than not be. So contact the school, check the guidance on the government website. There is a lot of guidance put out there by the Department for Education. And if there are summer schools, please try and enrol your children for summer schools and catch-up programmes, because it will make a huge difference to their lives. Most children, as I understand it, who've gone back to school are over the moon to be back in school, because school isn't just a place of educational learning, it's a place of team building. They have mentoring, well-being, pastoral care. Schools are much more nowadays than just about education, and that's why I'm so passionate about trying to get the kids back into school sooner rather than later.
Robert Halfon, from isolation in Harlow, but with a real passionate message there for schools. Thank you so much for coming on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's still plenty to discuss on this podcast. Professor Matthew Goodwin will be telling me why the Tories are now more popular with the poor than the rich. plus TikTok star Maggie Foster on how she soothed lockdown boredom by studying politicians' temper tantrums. Right after this.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
And we're back with me, Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. Now, as if 2020 hadn't thrown enough curveballs our way, the received political wisdom has always been that the Tories look after the rich and Labour look after the poor. But the report this week turns that on its head and says now that the Tory party is more popular amongst the lowest earners than the highest earners. That research was carried out by my next guest, Matthew Goodwin, of the University of Kent, and he found that the PM's promise to level up the nation, combined with the support for Brexit, is winning over these poorer voters. Matthew, good morning.
Good morning, Chris.
I wanted to know what you make of reports over the weekend and through this week that Number 10 is relying heavily on opinion polls. Do you think that's the best way of working out what the public is thinking? Because some backbench MPs worry they're not being consulted enough, and that's causing problems for the government.
Well, I think there's always been a tension between an approach that relies on national polls versus an approach that relies on backbench MPs reporting from individual constituencies. But as we know, Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings and the Number 10 team, a team that's gone through the 2016 referendum, that's also gone through the 2019 general election, has, you might argue, a more modern approach perhaps to these things than that traditional approach of relying on MPs as the mediator of public opinion. I think what is interesting also, given the report that they're relying extremely heavily on polling, would suggest that there's a broader strategy here at play about trying to navigate the public mood. And I'm quite interested in what that strategy is going to be.
Do you think MPs feel they're a better barometer of public feeling? And the recent issues we've had, the U-turn over Marcus Rashford and other cases like that they're not quite in touch with, and they've lost their touch with what people really want?
Well, I think the U-turn wasn't great for the Conservative Party. And like you, Chris, I've been talking to people on the ground. And if you talk to activists who would put themselves to the right of Johnson, there's certainly been a sense, to quote one activist who I talked to last week, that the government is rudderless, that there's a lack of direction, and that Boris Johnson appears to be reacting to events rather than reshaping the landscape. And that's come up time and time again in my interviews. And I think, the traditional view was that MPs don't only represent grassroots opinion, but also, make judgments on behalf of voters, which might not always be consistent with what voters want. And I think what we're seeing with Johnson's administration and certainly with some of the approaches that Dom Cummings has taken is a much more sort of direct line from campaigners to voters, and the intermediary voices are sort of, pushed to one side. And this was the theme of the referendum, Chris. We forget this now, right? But that was Cummings's argument, was that backbench MPs don't really understand grassroots public opinion, because they've been steeped in the sort of inertia and the institutions and the Westminster culture and have lost touch with the folks that they're representing.
And certainly as chairman of the lobby in the House of Commons for the past year, I've seen that close up when Number 10 have tried to, and have been, going round the usual way of talking through the press to talk directly to the people through Facebook Live and that kind of thing. You've authored a report this week from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which suggests quite interestingly that Boris Johnson is more popular with low paid than the rich. That raised eyebrows.
Well, this is the new reality of British politics, Chris, that the Conservatives used to be the party for the wealthy and Labour used to be the party for the poor. But for the first time in British political history, back in December when you and I were talking just ahead of that election, I remember it well in the Red Lion in Westminster, and we were saying, well, hang on a second, how are the Conservatives winning over a lot of these working class voters and what you might call blue collar Britain? And what actually happened, Chris, is they really became the first Conservative administration, if you want to call it that is now more successful than the Labour Party among people who are on low incomes. And the reason for that is because those voters, they're what we call cross-pressured, Chris. They lean left on the economy, so they agree with Labour on the economy, they want more redistribution, but they lean right on questions of culture and identity. So they loved what Boris was saying on immigration, on Brexit, on law and order, believing in Britain, being optimistic and positive. And what they did at the end of the day, Chris, is they put the culture and value questions above the economic questions. And that allowed Johnson to basically engineer this realignment of British politics. And we are in truly a historic time here. This is the first time it's ever happened in British political history.
I've long thought that Labour needs to love bunting. If they get the idea of bunting, they start to understand what you're talking about, I think.
Well, Chris, just to come in there, I mean, I'm reading a book at the moment, actually, on the different ways in which the Labour Party has seen the British nation. And, it does make the point that a few decades ago, the Labour Party were quite good at talking about the nation, were quite good at talking about patriotism. They were instinctively suspicious of things like the European Union and global finance and big corporate elites. Now, being led by Keir Starmer, somebody who presided over the second referendum strategy, which, by the way, we also show in our report was an absolute disaster for Labour because it opened up the northern flank to Johnson. And voters, crucially, Chris, noticed that. That's the fascinating thing to me that we found in this report. Voters noticed that Labour had drifted to the second referendum policy, and that really opened up the door for Johnson and Cummings across the Red Wall.
In your report, you say there that if the Tories are no longer the party of the rich and Labour isn't the party of the poor, does that open up, do you think, the landscape for new parties to represent the rich and the very poor?
Well, in my mind, there are two things now that are going to determine the future direction of British politics. Number one is whether the Conservatives can actually meet these voters halfway when it comes to the levelling up agenda. Can they actually do more than Conservatives have historically done, not only to meet these voters in terms of values by delivering Brexit, reforming migration, preserving national culture and heritage. For example, one thing these voters were deeply alarmed about, Chris, was the pulling down of statues and the unilateral way in which that was handled. So can the Conservatives not only meet them on culture, but can they also deliver this new, fair economic settlement, right? That's point one. Point two, can Labour repair their relationship with these voters on the cultural and identity questions? Or will Labour continue to be seen to dismiss these voters when it comes to things like Brexit and so forth? Those are the two key points that are basically going to determine where we go. If the parties fail to respond to this moment, then there will be a pretty significant gap in Britain for a party that leans left on the economy, that says, look, globalization's out of control, wages aren't rising quick enough, big corporates, big tech companies are having a laugh at your expense, but which also leans right on these questions and says, look, the Conservatives haven't controlled migration, or they got a rubbish Brexit deal, or they're not protecting national monuments and symbols. And so this formula, I've been pointing to it now for 4 or 5 years, this formula is the winning formula in British politics. And it goes to show how things have moved on from the days of Thatcherism and Blairism.
I suppose in 2024 that we're asking Britons to vote for a fifth time for a Tory government. And also, if we do have this huge state control of many areas of the economy, look at trains, look at probably state stakes in big companies that have been lent money and can't pay the money back as part of this COVID crisis, people may wonder why we need a Tory government when a Labour government could be better suited to handle that new world.
I think that's that's a fair observation. We used to talk, Chris, you and I, about Corbynomics, and I was making the point that many of Corbyn's key policies were actually rather popular. Things like nationalisation, things like state aid for failing businesses. Actually, we've got some of that. We've got state aid for failing businesses, and we've got 1 in 3 private sector employees being bankrolled by the state, at least for now. So I agree, how we transition out of the crisis is going to be really interesting. But here's another question that I'm thinking about. Chris, we still don't really know what Johnsonism is. We've got a glimpse. We had the budget. We've seen a bit of a pullback over 5G and Huawei. We've seen some loose talk around global Britain. But of course, then along came COVID-19 and basically blew everything out of the water. And there is part of me, my academic colleagues will hate me for saying this, but I do sort of feel sorry for Boris Johnson in a way, because, he waited his entire life to get this chance at power. And then along came not just one crisis, a health crisis, but an economic crisis too, and sort of blew apart his agenda. So as we come to the end of the year and go into, 2021 and on towards the next election, what I'd love to see somehow is the government get back to this question of what is Johnsonism? What's the philosophy behind this government, Chris? What do they really want to do? How do they want to transform the country? What's the economic strategy? And also, as a Conservative party, how are they going to start conserving some of the things that are wonderful about Britain? And I think those are the questions that these new voters are wanting to see answered.
What he'll say is levelling up is the key part of his agenda. There's more announced next week, maybe in a speech from Boris Johnson, we're told. Just before you go, Matthew, and thank you so much for joining on the podcast, how damaged is the PM, do you think, from the Dominic Cummings breaching of the lockdown rules? I know looking back now, we may think it was a bit of a storm in a teacup, but I think that did damage his man of the people image, don't you think, amongst maybe the red wall voters?
I think on balance it was damaging. I think you can see that this week, Chris. If you look at the polling, people were asked, who do you think's had a good or bad lockdown? Marcus Rashford, they say, has had a very good lockdown. Dominic Cummings, they say, has had a terrible lockdown. So people haven't forgotten. They're still remembering that incident. But I think as we drift towards the next election, that will move further and further from people's minds. And obviously Johnson took a decision that it's more important to try and keep the team together and try and deliver the broader changes that they want to see around the civil service, perhaps around the BBC, perhaps around universities, all of these institutions that they feel are perhaps working against them on some level. But also for me, you make this point that actually Johnson's going to get back to the levelling up agenda. Just something to leave you with, a lot of these voters, Chris, are not just looking for bridges and trains. Right? That's part of the story. Infrastructure is part of the story. But people didn't really vote for Johnson because they wanted infrastructure. They also voted for Johnson because they want a different kind of levelling up, a levelling up of ideas, a levelling up of ideologies. And for many of these voters, they feel that there's been an excessive liberal consensus within Britain for the past 30, 40 years that has overreached in many respects. They're deeply anxious about the politicisation of children in schools and on protests. And they're looking to the Conservatives not just to level up their regions and the economy, but to try and level up the value divide that is running through the country and perhaps tilt things a little bit more firmly back in a Conservative direction.
Well, Matthew Goodwin, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Now, if you have children of a certain age, like I do, you've undoubtedly heard of TikTok and been forced to learn what it is during this 10-week lockdown. For those of you able to escape that humiliation, it's a video social media app. And one of its breakout quarantine stars is my next guest, Meggie Foster. Meggie lip-syncs to politicians and public figures having spats, adding her own scenes and allowing us to appraise those spats in a different and often hilarious way. Her recent targets in politics include Priti Patel, Emily Thornberry, Caroline Flint, and even Robert Peston. If you haven't seen it, do Google her, or you're in for an absolute treat. Meggie Foster, welcome to Choppers Politics. How are you?
Thank you for having me. I'm very well. How are you?
Very good, thanks. I feel I know you very well, having watched your excellent TikTok videos. They are completely hilarious. You probably should explain to the audience of this podcast what it is you actually do.
Yeah, so in terms of what I do, I have started sort of doing these short vignettes, as it were, of politicians, celebrities, royalty. I basically gather audio from interviews and stuff like that. I either mash them all together or just use that clip. And then I do my own visual, which tells a sort of story that didn't really happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's gone very well. I think people like it, which is weird.
Oh, it's cheered us all up, I've got to say. I mean, the one when you had Caroline Flint and Emily Thornberry, they had a row about who said what about the other one to do with Brexit and the election. And it was, it was two politicians, senior politicians, having a row. But when you turned it into really schoolgirls having a row, you thought, yeah, that's right. It's all a bit pathetic, isn't it? And it
I
kind of
know.
let you reappraise it completely in a different picture. It was terrific.
Thank you very much. I mean, with that one, obviously those two interviews, they weren't speaking together, but they somehow fitted so perfectly. Because normally what I do is I sort of close my eyes and listen rather than try and watch what they're saying. So I can sort of create my own story in their head. So, come on, Caroline. It's like a schoolgirl, isn't it? Like maybe a little posh girl at school.
I forget which one was sucking on the milkshake.
Yeah, that was Emily Thornberry.
Like a row behind the bike shed.
I know.
It is really clever, and it does make us reappraise, I think, politics. What was the first one you did?
The first ever TikTok I did, I think, was of celebrity Gemma Collins. But in terms of sort of going more political, the one that got attention and started like this whole thing off was actually a protester from the elections last year. I asked friends and family to send me sort of material. And it was this girl who sounded incredibly posh. And I think we're all under the assumption that, if you're posh, you're more right wing.
Yes.
But what she was saying was incredibly left wing. And she also saying she wanted to be a doctor, but then wanted Boris to die. So the whole thing was just hilarious.
I think I saw that interview. She was interviewed, I think, outside Downing Street, wearing a really rude T-shirt, wasn't she? With a rude
Yeah,
brilliant, I think.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I decided just to put her in the most ridiculous situation where she was like drinking out of a gold rimmed goblet in a faux tweed outfit,
Yes.
just to make it more ridiculous. And that actually got picked up. So that started the ball rolling. And then I realised politics has actually quite a lot of funny stuff in it, which I'm not sure if is a good thing.
And how do you choose your targets? So there's quite an eclectic list in there. And do friends send in videos that would be quite funny for you to do? Or is it you scouring the internet?
It's a bit of both, really. Luckily, my brother actually is a journalist, so he's got sort of the inside knowledge of like what's happened and what's happening. But obviously, I do follow the news. So there's stuff from the past that are quite iconic. Natalie Bennett LBC interview. She was coughing in it, so I was like, right. So what could have started that cough off? So we're like, make it silly and just put a fly in there. She swallowed a fly. So yeah, I mean, it's all a bit of both. And then obviously the Boris one that was the Sunday evening. He'd done the Stay Alert speech, and I filmed it on the Monday morning, so that was obviously much more relevant. And then the Priti Patel one obviously was in the briefings as well.
Well, you couldn't read that long number out, could she? And just looking at different things.
Oh no, yeah, it's tragic.
Difficult for.
It's funny though.
But you don't take yourself too seriously, do you?
Yeah, so I think it's I think we've we're not in a very happy world at the moment.
No.
And I think we've all sort of forgotten how to laugh a bit. So I'm glad if it's made at least some people laugh. Then I'm very happy.
It certainly has. So I'll ask you, is that your home? It's a very nice home, big
thank
gardens,
you.
or was that a friend's house?
Well, I mean, I live in London normally. Obviously, when lockdown happened, I needed a bit of greenery. So I came back to Oxfordshire, where my mum and dad live. So I've just been here in lockdown for God knows how long. But yeah.
Trying to survive it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I've lived here all my life. I'll let my mum know that you like her house. She'll be happy with that.
Love a house. Very good. Any feedback from the targets? I know one politician, I better not name on air, who loved one of your skits.
Yeah, I've had a few MPs get in touch. Andrea Leadsom, she retweeted hers. Anna Soubry, Rosina Allen Khan. Caroline Flint's daughter actually described the Caroline Flint one as iconic, which was lovely. But I'm really glad that everyone can see that this is just a joke and that there's no point to be made in any of these videos. And it's actually really refreshing that, at least people are seeing it for what it is. And also Peston, his team got in touch. He actually sent me in his own clip of him saying, oh, thanks for reminding me of that, Meggie. And, people are just joining in, and it's really fun to see that everyone just gets it. They
do. The one of Andrea Leadsom when she leaded the House against John Bercow, when they clashed repeatedly over the basketball, you turned it into a row about the washing up, which I thought was entirely
business
right.
Of the house, reminding me of my mum and dad.
I know, it's trivialised it correctly. Do you have a favourite you haven't done yet? A favourite politician you haven't had a go at?
I don't know. I've got some ideas of who to do next. I think Sadiq Khan needs to come somewhere down there. But yeah, I think in terms of what I want next, there's quite a few there that can be done. I'm just trying to sort of source out stuff.
Yeah. And I can ask you, are you making money out of these things yet? Is money made on TikTok videos?
I think there's definitely opportunities for sort of like brands getting in touch and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I would definitely love to monetize these, but also sort of go down the route of maybe creating my own characters as well.
In a way, a kind of Catherine Tate, kind of character comedian.
She's been a massive influence throughout my sort of life. I've watched her for years, and I think her stuff is hilarious. And I think there's opportunities to sort of maybe create my own characters and keep the lip syncing in of real life people. And I think that's the great thing, is that I'm not putting any words in anyone's mouth.
No. It's
just making them more ridiculous. And I think when I put them in situations, people are like, actually, gosh, that was actually what they said, and they actually listening to the words more. So it's quite interesting, really.
Well, Maggie Foster, absolutely great to have you on. We're all huge fans of yours at Choppers Politics. Keep doing it.
Thank you so much.
Keep making us laugh, and thank you for coming on. Thank you, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you to my guests this week, Robert Halfon, Professor Matthew Goodwin, and of course Maggie Foster. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Elliot Lampitt, and Theo Ludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening and taking time to leave reviews and ratings for this podcast. Surfs Up wrote this week, "It's refreshing to hear politicians speak with honesty and sincerity. Keep up the good work, Chris." Thank you, Surfs Up, and please do keep up the good work by telling your friends to tune into this podcast and make it a favourite if you like what we're doing. Your reviews really help others find this podcast. If you're all caught up on Choppers Politics and twiddling your thumbs, please go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get 30 days free access to all of our best coronavirus coverage, opinion, sport, politics, culture, and much, much more, including the obituaries, which I think are brilliant. Now I'll be back with a special bonus edition of Choppers Politics on Monday. Anyone who's intrigued about New Zealand's comparatively successful approach to tackling coronavirus might be interested in listening to this interview with the Deputy Prime Minister of New Zealand, Winston Peters. But until next time, please, if you can, buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Otherwise, cheerio!